The telegram slipped from Levi Maddox's fingers and fluttered to the dirt floor of the relay station like a dead leaf falling from a November oak, and the words burned in his mind long after the paper left his hand. Herd gone, all 400 head. Stampede drove them south into Badlands. Search party returned empty. Consider them lost. Maddox ranch finished. 400 head of prime Texas longhorn. 4 years of breeding, of early mornings and late nights, of bleeding hands and borrowed money from men who would not wait another season for repayment. 4 years of his dead father's dream made flesh and hooves and sinew, all of it now swallowed by the jagged canyon country south of the Pecos River, country that even the most experienced cowboys refused to enter on a wager. Levi stood in the doorway of the relay station at Fort Stockton, Texas, in the brutal June heat of 1878, and he felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with bones. The station manager, old Clyde Perkins, watched him with the careful, sorrowful eyes of a man who had delivered bad news before. He cleared his throat. "There was a woman here yesterday asking about that same stretch of country," he said carefully. "She said she knew the Badlands south of the Pecos better than any man alive. Said she could find a lost dog in that canyon maze if you gave her 3 days. Levi looked up slowly. His jaw was hard and his gray eyes were flat with the particular kind of pain that has not yet decided whether it will become grief or fury. "A woman," he repeated, and his voice carried no mockery. It carried only exhaustion. "Julia Bristol," Clyde said. "She guides freight parties and survey crews through country nobody else will touch. Half the Army mapping teams from Fort Davis have hired her at one point or another. She knows that canyon system better than she knows her own reflection." Levi picked up his hat from the counter and set it on his head with a deliberateness that looked like a man composing himself before he walked into a fire. "Where do I find her?" he asked. 3 hours earlier, before that telegram had arrived, and before Levi, Maddox had stood in that relay station with the ruins of everything he had worked for scattered around his boots. The story had begun in a way that felt almost ordinary. Levi had ridden into Fort Stockton from the north on a raw-boned buckskin horse named Copper, having pushed hard for 2 days after receiving word that his trail boss, a veteran cowman named Darnell Hicks, had sent the herd south toward the Pecos, crossing ahead of schedule to beat an approaching drought that was already browning the grass across the northern ranges. It was a reasonable decision, the kind of decision an experienced trail boss made without consulting the ranch owner, and Levi had not been alarmed. He had ridden south expecting to meet the herd somewhere between the river and the Davis Mountains. Instead, he had found a camp of 8 of his own cowboys sitting around a dead fire with the particular stillness of men who had used up all their words. Darnell Hicks had met him at the edge of that camp with his hat in his hand, and his face arranged into the expression of a man delivering a death notice. The stampede had come in the night. Something had spooked the herd, and in the darkness and confusion the longhorns had broken south at a dead run into the canyon country. And by the time the cowboys had got their horses under them and given chase, the herd had dissolved into the maze of draws and arroyos and blind canyon walls that made up the Badlands below the Pecos. They had searched for 2 days. They had found hoof prints disappearing into rocky ground that left no further trace, and they had found 1 steer with a broken leg that had to be put down, and they had found nothing else. 400 head of prime longhorn do not simply vanish. Levi knew that. Cattle do not evaporate, but they could scatter through 50 miles of broken country in ways that made them effectively invisible to men searching on horseback without knowledge of the terrain. The search party had not had that knowledge. The Badlands south of the Pecos had earned their name honestly. They were a tangle of mesa tops, box canyons, seasonal creek beds that ran dry and unpredictable, and terrain so broken that a man could ride in circles for 3 days without realizing he had covered the same ground twice. Levi had listened to Darnell's account with his hands loose at his sides, and his expression perfectly controlled, and then he had ridden to Fort Stockton to think. The telegram waiting for him there from his banker in San Antonio had made the thinking considerably more urgent. The bank wanted payment on the note that had financed the herd's purchase. Without the cattle, without the drive to the railhead at Abilene, without the sale price that represented the year's only income, Levi Maddox would lose not just 400 longhorns but the ranch itself. Every acre of grass and limestone that his father had broken his health to purchase would pass to men in suits who had never once watched the sun rise over open country. He had 90 days. Which was how he found himself, 20 minutes after reading that telegram, walking into the dusty boot saloon on the main street of Fort Stockton, Texas, looking for a woman named Julia Bristol. She was not hard to find. She was standing at the bar with one boot heel hooked on the brass rail, drinking what appeared to be coffee rather than whiskey, and she was in a conversation with two men that was clearly not going well for either of those men. She was tall for a woman of that era, standing perhaps 5 feet and 7 inches, with dark brown hair pulled back in a practical braid, and a face that was weathered and striking in equal measure, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that moved with the quick, cataloging intelligence of someone who was always reading the landscape in front of her. She wore canvas riding trousers and a linen shirt and a battered leather vest over it, and she wore a single revolver on her right hip in a well-worn holster that sat naturally, as though she had been born wearing it. Her hands, resting on the bar, were capable and strong, with the kind of competence written into every tendon. The two men she was talking to were trying to convince her of something, and she was declining, and her manner of declining was not the nervous deflection of a woman in an uncomfortable situation. It was the flat, patient, entirely unimpressed refusal of someone who had better things to do. "Miss Bristol," one of the men was saying. He was a heavy man in a canvas coat, flushed with the effort of persuasion. "We are offering you $50 and no questions asked. All we need is a guide through the lower canyon system to the old Comanche trails. 1 week, maybe less." "I know what you want the Comanche trails for," Julia said, and her voice was low and clear and carried no particular emotion. "There are silver artifacts in those canyons that belong to nobody's pocket. I don't guide looters. Find someone else." The second man leaned in with the particular posture of a man who believes his physical size is a convincing argument. "Now listen here, we aren't asking your opinion on the matter. We're asking you to do a job and take the money." Julia Bristol turned her head and looked at him with an expression so calm and so utterly without fear that it seemed to briefly confuse him. "I said no," she told him, as though explaining something to a slow child. "I recommend you hear it this time." There was a moment of tension that could have gone several ways. Then Levi Maddox stepped up to the bar beside her, angled his body subtly so that he stood at her shoulder rather than behind her, which was a distinction that mattered, and he looked at the two men with the unhurried, absolute steadiness of a man who had been in genuine trouble before and found these two unimpressive. "I believe the lady concluded the conversation," he said. The heavy man in the canvas coat looked at Levi for 3 full seconds, calculating the various implications of those gray eyes and that broad frame and the particular set of that jaw, and then apparently decided his silver artifacts could wait for another day. He and his companion moved off without another word. Julia Bristol turned and looked at Levi Maddox with a gaze that was assessing and entirely direct and not particularly grateful. "I was handling that," she said. "I noticed," he said. "I wasn't interrupting. I was just standing close enough to be inconvenient for them." Something in her expression shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. "You're the man looking for a trail guide," she said. "It was not a question. Clyde Perkins sent word. Clyde sends me word about most things. It's a small town." She picked up her coffee mug. 400 longhorn in the Badlands south of the Pecos. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at something beyond the bar. Then she said, "Most people who lose cattle in that country accept the loss. The terrain doesn't give back what it takes. I can't afford to accept it, Levi said. His voice was simple and honest and carried no particular drama, which was somehow more convincing than desperation would have been. Julia looked at him again, properly this time, the way she had looked at that canyon country 1,000 times, reading the specifics rather than the general impression. The stampede would have driven them south by southwest, she said, as though thinking out loud. The canyon systems in that quadrant funnel animals into a series of natural holding grounds, box canyons with grass and seasonal water. A herd that size doesn't scatter infinitely, it collects in pockets. She paused. Most search parties look for movement. They ride through and look for animals moving in the open. But cattle in that country go still and go deep. You have to know where to look. Do you know where to look? Levi asked. I know every box canyon, every seasonal spring, every grazing pocket in that system for 50 miles in every direction. I mapped it for the Army Corps of Engineers in 1875. She set down her mug. I can find your cattle. He felt something move in him that was neither hope nor relief, but something quieter and more complicated, like the moment when a door you thought was locked turns out to be simply stiff. What do you charge? He asked. $150 for a successful recovery. Nothing if I don't deliver. She said it simply as a fact. I don't take money for failures. My reputation doesn't have room for it. He held out his hand. She looked at it for one beat, then shook it with a grip that was firm and businesslike, and carried a specific message about who she was. We ride at dawn, Julia Bristol said. They spent that evening making preparations that were efficient and largely silent in the comfortable way of two people who understand that action is more valuable than conversation in the hours before a difficult undertaking. Levi purchased supplies at the mercantile, choosing dried beef, hardtack, coffee, and rope, with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years on working ranches and knew what mattered on the trail and what was weight without purpose. Julia arrived at the stables while he was saddling Copper, and she was leading a paint mare that was compact and deep through the chest, with the kind of intelligence in her eye that experienced horsemen recognize as the best kind. She had added a bedroll to her kit and what appeared to be a rolled canvas map case that she secured carefully to her saddle. Her name is Vera, Julia said of the mare before he could ask. Good horse, Levi said, and he meant it. Julia glanced at him. Yes. They were joined by Darnell Hicks, who had agreed to come along with two of the remaining cowboys, a young man of 20 named Pete Garza, who had grown up near the Pecos, and an older hand called Amos, who had the particular value of doing exactly what he was told without needing to be told twice. Levi had sent the other 5 cowboys back to the ranch to hold things together in his absence. As they rode south out of Fort Stockton in the gray light before dawn, Levi found himself watching Julia Bristol from the corner of his eye with the specific attention of a man who is trying to assess whether the person he has entrusted with everything important is worthy of that trust. She rode without any of the unnecessary motion that marks amateur riders, with the economy of a person and horse that have become so accustomed to each other that they communicate in suggestions rather than commands. She kept her eyes on the country ahead with the constant, methodical attention of someone who is reading rather than simply looking. He had hired trail guides before. He had hired experienced men with good reputations and solid credentials. None of them had carried themselves like this, with this particular quality of competence that was so complete it did not need to announce itself. Darnell Hicks rode up beside Levi as the sun began to lift above the eastern horizon, painting the limestone country in shades of copper and rust. He kept his voice low. You sure about this? Darnell said. He was not asking about the mission. He was asking about Julia. No, Levi said honestly, but I'm sure I've got nothing better. She's got a reputation, Darnell said. Not a bad one, just an unusual one. They say she spent 3 years living with a band of Mescalero Apache up near the Guadalupe Mountains before she started guiding. Say she learned that canyon country from them, the way they know it, not the way white men know it. Levi considered this. Does it matter how she learned it if she learned it right? Darnell had no answer for that. Julia had heard them speaking. She did not turn her head, but something in the set of her shoulders acknowledged the conversation without making an issue of it. She had lived long enough in this particular country, navigating the particular landscape of being a woman who did work that men thought belonged to them, to know when she was being discussed, and when to let the discussion reach its own conclusion without her interference. Her story, the parts of it that mattered to who she had become, had begun not with the Apache, though that chapter had shaped everything that came after, but with her father. Thomas Bristol had been a surveyor for the Texas General Land Office, and he had brought his daughter into the field with him from the time she was old enough to read a compass, which in her case had been younger than most adults expected. She had grown up reading topographic signs the way other children read primers, learning to read drainage patterns and rock formations, and the behavioral signatures of water moving through limestone country. By the time she was 19, she could survey a section of land faster and more accurately than any of the men her father employed. Her mother had died of fever when Julia was 12, and she had grown up in that particular freedom and loneliness that belongs to children raised primarily by the wilderness, acquiring a self-sufficiency so deep it had become structural, a load-bearing wall in the architecture of who she was. The 3 years among the Mescalero Apache had not been a captivity or a romantic adventure. It had been a deliberate apprenticeship. She had met a band in the Guadalupe Mountains while on a solo survey mission in 1872, when she was 22 years old, and the elder women of the band had recognized in her a quality of attentiveness, a willingness to learn from the land rather than impose upon it, that was rare enough to be valuable. She had stayed, learning the canyon systems from people who had inhabited them for generations, whose knowledge ran centuries deeper than any government survey, and she had left 3 years later carrying a map of that country in her head that no instrument could fully replicate. She had been guiding since 1875, and she had never lost a client in the Badlands, and she had never returned from a search without finding what she was sent to find. This was the woman riding 3 lengths ahead of Levi Maddox as they moved south into the broken country below the Pecos, and he did not yet fully understand what he had hired. He was about to find out. By mid-morning of the first day, they had crossed the Pecos at a shallow ford and entered the canyon country proper. The landscape changed with the abruptness of a door opening onto a different world. The flat limestone plains fell away behind them, and the land broke into a labyrinth of arroyos, eroded mesas, and canyon walls that rose 60 and 70 feet in deep shades of red and orange sandstone streaked with white limestone intrusions. Julia stopped on a promontory overlooking the first major draw and pulled her map case free, and Levi rode up beside her to look. The map was unlike anything he had ever seen in a surveyor's chart. It was a large-scale, hand-drawn topographic rendering of extraordinary detail, showing not just the major canyon systems but their subdivisions, the seasonal watercourses, the grass pockets, and marked in a different color ink, what appeared to be natural funneling routes, places where the terrain would naturally direct large animals moving under panic. The stampede ran south by southwest, Julia said, tracing a line with her finger without touching the map. At full run, a longhorn herd doesn't make choices. It follows the path of least resistance. That means they ran into the Bequilla's draw system here, and from there the terrain would have split them into 3 natural channels. She pointed to 3 distinct areas of the map. The east channel dead ends in a box canyon with seasonal grass and a spring that runs this time of year. The center channel feeds into a broader mesa system with scattered grazing. The west channel is steeper and would have discouraged most animals, but some would have followed it and collected in the lower pocket. Levi studied the map. So you think the herd split into 3 groups? I think the herd split into 3 groups and has been grazing in those pockets for the past 4 days, Julia said. Cattle that aren't being chased will settle where there's food and water. They don't keep running. Your previous search party, she said to Darnell without looking at him. Which directions did you cover? Darnell shifted in his saddle. We rode the main draws, the big open country. You missed all three of those pockets, Julia said, and her voice was not unkind. It was simply factual. They're accessible only through terrain that doesn't look like passage from the outside. The east pocket entrance looks like a dead end from a quarter-mile out. You have to know it turns. Darnell said nothing, but his jaw tightened with the particular embarrassment of a competent man who has learned he was less competent than he thought. We'll take the east pocket first, Julia said, rolling the map and securing it. It will have the most cattle. The funneling effect of that channel is the strongest. She was already moving before the sentence was finished, guiding Vera down a route into the draw that Levi would not have identified as a route at all from where he stood. It looked like solid wall. But she angled through it with complete confidence, and when they followed her, they found a narrow passage between two rock faces that widened gradually into a traversable arroyo. Levi rode in silence behind her, watching the way she read the ground. She stopped once to examine a scuff on a limestone shelf that he would not have registered as anything at all. She studied it for perhaps 4 seconds and then said, "Cattle came through here within the last 48 hours. Multiple animals moving slowly. They were grazing, not running." "How can you tell the difference?" Pete Garza asked. He was young enough to ask the question without embarrassment, which Levi privately appreciated because he had wondered the same thing. "Running animals hit the rock hard, they don't pause. The marks are sharp and deep with a directional drive. Grazing animals drag their feet slightly. Different wear pattern." She glanced back at Pete. "Your eye learns it once you know to look." They rode for another hour through the winding arroyo system, and the canyon walls rose higher around them, and the shade fell cool and strange in the deep cuts of the rock, and the country had the quality of a secret kept very well for a very long time. Then Julia held up her hand and they stopped. From ahead, muffled by the canyon walls, came a sound that Levi Maddox had not expected to hear again. The low, collective sound of a large herd at rest. The sound of hundreds of cattle moving slowly, breathing, the occasional low complaint of a steer finding its footing on rocky ground. He did not say anything. He could not say anything for a moment. Julia turned and looked at him, and her expression was quiet and unreadable and somehow very gentle, the way a person looks when they are giving someone back something they thought was gone forever. "East pocket," she said simply, "just around that bend." They came around the bend in the canyon wall, and the box canyon opened before them like a secret room, wide and grass-floored and fed by a clear spring that ran along the east wall. And in it, grazing with the placid indifference of animals that had found themselves in comfortable circumstances and seen no reason to complain about it, were well over 100 head of Levi Maddox's prime Texas longhorn. Levi pulled Copper to a stop and sat very still. Something happened in his chest that was too large and too complicated to name. For days ago, he had read a telegram that told him everything he had built was finished. And here, in a hidden canyon that he would never have found in a lifetime of searching, were his cattle, alive and healthy and grazing on spring grass as though they had arranged a pleasant holiday. He became aware that his hands were not entirely steady on the reins. Darnell Hicks made a sound that was mostly exhaled breath. Pete Garza said something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Amos simply began counting heads with the automatic competence of a man who could not resist inventory even in a moment of miracle. Levi turned his head and looked at Julia Bristol. She had already moved off to the side, examining the canyon perimeter with that perpetual cataloging attention, checking the herd's condition, noting the water source, reading the landscape with the thoroughness of a professional completing a job she had committed to completing correctly. She had found them. Exactly as she had said she would. With the specific, detailed knowledge she had described, applied with the systematic precision of someone who had mapped this country with her mind and her hands and 3 years of her life. He had been impressed by her intelligence from the first conversation. He had been struck by her competence and her self-possession, and the particular quality of her certainty when she described what she would do. But watching her now, in the reality of what she had just accomplished, something shifted in him that was fundamentally different from being impressed. It was the recognition of genuine excellence, the kind that does not need to perform itself, the kind that simply produces results that speak with the absolute authority of reality. He felt, with a force that surprised him considerably, that this was one of the most remarkable people he had ever encountered in his life. "2 pockets still to check," Julia called without turning around. He gathered himself. "Right," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. They spent the rest of that first day working the center pocket and the west channel. Julia's analysis had been exactly correct. The center pocket held 160 cattle, and the west channel's lower pocket held 87, including the nervous young heifers that Darnell had been specifically anxious about. By the time the light began to fail, and they made camp in a flat stretch of the main draw, the count stood at 343 head located and confirmed. "We're 57 head short of 400, Darnell said, reviewing his tally book in the firelight. "There's a 4th collection area that I didn't consider until I saw the terrain behavior today," Julia said. She was drinking her coffee and looking at her map, and she had the focused, inward look of someone revising a calculation. "A seasonal water source about 6 miles west that I haven't had reason to check in the past 2 years. Given the distribution of what we found today, it's the most likely location for the remainder." "You think you can find them," Levi said. "I know I can find them," Julia said, not with arrogance, with the calm certainty of someone stating a verifiable fact. The firelight moved across her face, and Levi watched it with an attention he could not quite account for and was not entirely comfortable with. He had not thought about a woman with any particular feeling in 3 years. Not since Eleanor Crane in San Antonio had taken one careful look at the trajectory of his life, all that debt, and all that weather and all that uncertainty, and had married a banker instead, which was probably the correct decision for her, and had left him with a kind of resigned solitude that he had eventually stopped fighting. He had poured himself into the ranch with the focused devotion of a man who has redirected everything that might otherwise go toward intimacy, and it had worked reasonably well in practical terms, and he had told himself more than once that it was sufficient. Watching Julia Bristol in the firelight, revising her mental map with absolute concentration, he felt something stir that his careful self-sufficiency had kept very quiet for a very long time. He looked away and drank his coffee. Darnell Hicks, who had known Levi for 8 years, and who had the inconvenient talent of noticing things he was not meant to notice, said nothing. But the quality of his silence was communicative. They slept in their bedrolls under a sky that was absolutely enormous and absolutely clear, the stars of the Texas high desert winter present in their full and staggering quantity, and the canyon walls absorbed the firelight and gave back a warmth that made the night more comfortable than the open country above. Levi lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the camp settling and the distant sound of the herd in the east pocket, and thinking about the 90 days until the bank's deadline, and thinking about the drive to Abilene, and then finding his thoughts returning to the woman asleep in her bedroll 20 feet away with the complete, uncomplicated ease of someone who has slept on harder ground in worse country and made peace with all of it. He fell asleep eventually, and he did not dream, and when he woke the fire was still casting coals and the sky was going gray, and Julia Bristol was already awake, already at the fire, already studying her map with the quiet thoroughness of someone who began preparing for the day's work before the day arrived. "The water source is here," she said when she heard him moving, without looking up, as though continuing a conversation she had been having with herself. "A limestone spring that runs seasonal from about April through September. It's inside a blind canyon that trends northeast, easy to miss. Distinctive because the entrance corridor runs against the prevailing drainage angle, so most surveyors assume it's a dead formation. She looked up then. I found it in 1873 with Running Water's grandmother. She showed it to me because she thought it was funny that the government maps had it all wrong. He poured coffee and sat down and said, "Running Water." She was a Mescalero elder. 80 years old, and she could walk that canyon country for 10 hours without needing water because she knew every seep and spring by the particular smell of the rock. I have never met anyone who knew land the way she knew that land. Julia paused. She died in 1876. She would have been pleased to know her canyon found someone's cattle. There was something very human and very private in her voice when she said that, and Levi sat with it carefully. "You were close to her," he said. "She taught me more than my father did," Julia said simply. "And my father was a brilliant man." She folded her map. "We should move within the hour." The Blind Canyon was 6 miles west and 4 miles south, reached by a route that required twice crossing a dry creek bed and following a limestone shelf that was barely wide enough for a horse at one point. And Julia navigated it without hesitation, reading the country through some combination of memory and instinct, and the accumulated knowledge of 3 years of immersive education that Levi was beginning to understand was fundamentally unlike any other expertise he had encountered. They found the remaining cattle exactly where she predicted. 59 head, actually, including 3 that Levi had not initially accounted for, calves that had been born during the stampede's aftermath, and were now nursing with the placid determination of newborns who have no concept of crisis. Levi stood at the canyon entrance and watched Julia Bristol count heads, calling the tally to Darnell with the systematic efficiency of someone completing an inventory, and he felt the full weight of the past 4 days come off his shoulders with an almost physical sensation, like a pack dropped after a long carry. 402 cattle, 3 more than he started with, alive and healthy and grazing in hidden canyon pockets that the best cowboys in West Texas had ridden past without finding. He walked over to where she stood and he stopped in front of her and he said, "Julia." She looked up at him. The morning light was flat and honest, and it showed every detail of her face with the impartiality of good light. The weathering and the intelligence and the particular quality of guardedness that he was beginning to understand was not coldness, but the careful economy of a person who did not waste attention on things that were not worth it. "You found every last head," he said. 402, she said. "The calves are a bonus." He was very close to her, closer than professional courtesy strictly required. Neither of them stepped back. "I don't have the words," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I don't have the words for what this means." "You have a ranch that won't fail," she said, and her voice was softer than her usual flat precision. "That's the word." He looked at her for a moment longer than the situation strictly required, and she looked back at him with those dark, precise eyes, and somewhere in that exchange, something was communicated that neither of them put into language because it was too new and too uncertain, and too important to risk with imprecise words. Then Darnell called out about one of the older steers showing a lame leg, and the moment broke, and they both turned toward the practical demands of the present. The drive to consolidate the cattle took 2 days. Julia worked with Darnell and the cowboys to move each pocket group to a central staging area in the main draw where they could be joined and controlled. And she was as effective in this work as she was in navigation, moving among the cattle with a knowledge of herd behavior that surprised Darnell Hicks into a respect he expressed in the wordless way of ranch men, which was to start doing exactly what she suggested without the brief, resistant pause he had been giving her suggestions until that point. Pete Garza simply attached himself to her orbit and watched everything she did with the intense concentration of a young man who is learning from someone genuinely worth learning from. On the second evening of the consolidation drive, with the herd settled and the camp comfortable, and the evening air carrying the particular clean smell of high desert country after a day's work, Darnell Hicks found a reason to check on the horse lines, and Pete Garza found a reason to be wherever Amos was, and Levi Maddox and Julia Bristol found themselves alone by the fire for the first time since the search had begun. They were quiet for a while, which was not uncomfortable. Levi had noticed that silence with Julia was never uncomfortable. It had the quality of shared ground rather than empty space. "What happens after this?" he said eventually. "I ride back to Fort Stockton," she said. "You pay me. I take the next guide job." "What's the next guide job?" "There's a railroad survey crew wanting a guide through the Glass Mountains. 2 weeks, reasonable pay." She paused. "I take the work that's there." "You could make a great deal more money if you worked for one outfit consistently," he said, and he was careful about his tone, making sure it did not sound like what it was, which was a man trying to find a way to keep a woman in his vicinity without the courage yet to say so directly. She read it anyway. He could see the awareness of it move through her expression, subtle and clear. "I've had offers like that," she said, "from the Army, from survey companies, from ranch operations." She looked at the fire. "I've always turned them down." "Why?" "Because the moment I'm working for one person I'm no longer my own," she said, and there was no drama in it. It was simply the truth of who she was, stated with the same simple directness she applied to everything. "I've been my own for 30 years. It suits me." "You're 30 years old," he said, not with the calculation of a man working out arithmetic, but with the surprise of someone who had not been precisely aware before and found it relevant. 30 in September," she said. "Does that matter?" "No," he said. "I'm 33. I was just noting that we're contemporaries." She looked at him with a slight shift in her expression that might, in different light, have been the beginning of something warmer. "Yes," she said, "we are." The fire cracked between them and sent a small shower of sparks upward into the dark, and the stars above the canyon walls were as enormous as they had been every night, and Levi Maddox decided, with the quiet internal determination of a man reaching a conclusion after a long deliberation, that he was not going to let this particular moment be all he had. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a genuine question, not as an offer of employment." She waited. "If I weren't the man who hired you, if we had met some other way, the way people who have nothing to negotiate just meet, would you have been interested in knowing me?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that was making its way carefully toward daylight. "That's a complicated question," Julia said. "I know. Because the man who hired me is the man I know," she said. "And the man I know is someone who, when he found out everything he had was gone, rode to find it rather than sitting down in it. Someone who hired a woman to guide him in country where most men would have hired another man on principle, not because they thought it would work better but because it was easier. Someone who listened when I spoke and who didn't try to improve on my roots and who looks at this country the way I look at this country, like it's worth understanding rather than just using." Levi was very still. "So yes," Julia said, and her voice was quiet and exact. "If we had met some other way, I would have been interested in knowing you. And since we met this way instead, I find myself interested in knowing you regardless." It was the most direct declaration that was also not quite a declaration that he had ever heard, and it was perfectly suited to who she was, and it made something in his chest tighten with an intensity that had nothing to do with anxiety. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them by a degree that was deliberate and careful, and she did not move away. "I don't want this to be the end of knowing you," he said. "Then it doesn't have to be," she said. They did not kiss that night. It was too soon, and they were both too careful and too honest for gestures that outran understanding. But they sat by that fire until it was very late, talking, really talking, the way two people talk when they are discovering that the other person's mind is a place they want to spend more time, and the night was warm and the stars were relentless, and the herd was settled, and the canyon held them in its ancient, indifferent peace. They talked about her father and his father, about the work of building something from raw land in hard weather, about the 3 years among the mescalero, and the particular loneliness of being someone who belongs to more than one world and fully to none. About what it meant to know a piece of country so well that it ceased to be landscape and became something closer to language. About what he had wanted when he started the ranch and what he had actually built, and where the gap lay between those two things. About what she had wanted when she started guiding, and why she had chosen freedom over security, and whether, at 30 years old, those calculations were the same as they had been at 22. She did not give him any ground he had not honestly earned, and she did not pretend to feelings she was still in the process of identifying. But by the time they finally moved to their bedrolls, and the camp settled into its final quiet, Levi Maddox knew, with the particular clarity that comes from full attention paid to what is actually in front of you, that he had found something in this canyon country that was considerably more valuable than 400 Longhorn. The drive back to Fort Stockton took 4 days, moving the consolidated herd north at a pace that kept the animals comfortable and together, with Julia taking the point position on Vieira and reading the terrain ahead with the same systematic attention she had applied to the search. She and Levi rode together often over those 4 days, sometimes talking and sometimes simply riding in the comfortable parallel silence that had become their natural register, and Darnell Hicks watched this development with the careful non-expression of a man who is actively reserving all judgment. Pete Garza was less reserved. On the 3rd day he pulled up beside Amos and said in a voice that he perhaps thought was quieter than it was, "You reckon the boss is sweet on the trail guide?" Amos looked straight ahead. "Young man," he said, "if you can't see that from 100 yards in full daylight, your eyesight needs attending to." On the morning of the 4th day, when they were within sight of the corrals at the edge of Fort Stockton's grazing lease, Julia pulled Vera alongside Copper and rode for a while in silence before she said, "There's a matter I should tell you about." He looked at her. Those 2 men in the dusty boot, the ones who wanted the Comanche Trail guide, she kept her eyes forward. "Their names are Cutter Walsh and Ben Farrow. They work for a man named Harlan Sisk. Sisk has been acquiring land in this country for 3 years through methods that are not always legal and are never honest. He has a particular interest in any operation that finds itself financially vulnerable." Levi was quiet for a moment. "He knows about the bank debt. He knows about most things in this region. He has people who tell him things." She paused. "He is going to know that your cattle have been found. And he is going to know that you are now in a position to clear your debt if you drive to Abilene this season. Which means he has a narrowing window to create a situation that makes that impossible." "You're warning me," Levi said. "I'm telling you what I know," she said. "What you do with it is your business." He turned it over in his mind. "How do you know about Sisk?" "He approached me 2 years ago about guiding him to some of the more remote Mescalero sacred sites in the Guadalupe Mountains. Said he wanted to conduct what he called archaeological preservation. I knew what he actually wanted. I declined. He had me followed for 2 weeks afterward to see if he could learn the routes without me." She said it without heat, just as fact. "He learned I was aware of the surveillance and he stopped. We have not been on friendly terms since." "He's dangerous," Levi said. "He's the kind of man who is dangerous specifically to people who are not prepared for him," Julia said. "He relies on people not knowing he's coming. That's his method. Then knowing he's coming changes the equation considerably." He looked at her. "You could have told me this when it became relevant and not mentioned it. It's not part of what I hired you for." She met his gaze steadily. "No," she said, "it isn't." He understood what she was saying and what she was not saying, and both of those things mattered. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it with the full weight of the word. When they brought the herd into the Fort Stockton corrals, the event attracted the kind of attention that unusual things always attract in small towns. People stood along the fence and watched the cattle come in with the surprised, interested expression of people who had heard something was impossible and were watching it disprove itself. Clyde Perkins was at the gate and he watched Levi drive the lead animals in, and he turned and looked at Julia riding behind them, and he shook his head slowly with an expression that was equal parts admiration and something that looked like pride. "Every last head," he called out to her. 402, Julia said. 3 bonus calves, Clyde laughed. It was a big, genuine laugh. "I told him you could do it," he said. "You told him I could find a lost dog," Julia replied, and she was almost smiling. Levi paid her that evening, the full $150 in bank notes, and he did it in Clyde's station with Darnell present as witness. And when he counted it out and set it on the counter between them, she looked at it for a moment, and then folded it and put it in her vest pocket without counting it again, because she had heard him count it and found no reason to doubt what she had heard. "I want to propose something else," Levi said. He had his hat in his hands, which was, for him, a form of vulnerability, not a job. "A conversation. If you're in Fort Stockton for a few days before the survey job, I'd like to have supper with you, not as employer and guide, as 2 people." She looked at him with those precise dark eyes. "There's a decent dining room at the Cattleman's Hotel," she said. "Thursday evening." "Thursday evening," he agreed. He stayed in Fort Stockton to arrange the logistics of the drive north to Abilene, and to send telegrams to the bank, and to deal with the dozen administrative demands of a working ranch operation that had come to a critical juncture. And on Thursday evening, he walked into the Cattleman's Hotel dining room to find Julia Bristol already seated, and she was wearing a dress. It was not a particularly formal dress. It was a clean, simple dress in a deep green fabric that nonetheless made him stop in the doorway for a second because of the complete unexpectedness of it, coming from a person he had known almost exclusively in canvas trousers and leather, was a kind of revelation. She looked up and saw him stop, and one corner of her mouth moved in a way that was decidedly amused. He crossed the room and sat down across from her and said, "Good evening," with what he considered reasonable composure. "You look surprised," she said. "I am somewhat surprised," he admitted. "I own 2 dresses," she said. "I find them useful on specific occasions." "What occasions?" "Situations where I want to be recognized as a complete human person rather than a professional function," she said, and she said it with the quiet directness that was so wholly hers. He leaned forward slightly over the table. "I recognized you as a complete human person in canvas trousers," he said. Something in her expression went still and then warmer in a way that he was learning to read, the specific way her composure shifted when something touched her unexpectedly. "Yes," she said after a moment, "I know." They had supper, actual supper with a tablecloth and a menu and wine that was not as bad as he expected. And they talked for 3 hours without the conversation finding any reason to stop. She told him about the Glass Mountain survey and the 3-week expedition she had made into the Big Bend country the previous spring, and he told her about the decision to purchase the original Maddox land, the precise afternoon when he had stood on a limestone hill above a dry creek and known with absolute conviction that this was the ground he wanted to build on. He told her about his father, old Jacob Maddox, who had worked a cattle operation in East Texas and died before he saw his son's ranch become what it was. And she told him about watching her own father's health decline after years in the field and the specific grief of watching a person become less than who they had been. They had both been formed by loss, and they both wore it in the same way, not as damage but as depth, not as something that had broken them but as something that had insisted on their attention and left them more real. At the end of the evening, walking out onto the boardwalk in the warm June night, they stood for a moment under the lamp at the hotel door, and the sound of Fort Stockton settling toward sleep moved around them gently. "I'm going to ask you something direct," Levi said, "because you're a direct person, and I think that's the only kind of asking that makes sense with you." "Ask," she said. "I want to see you again after Thursday. I want to ride out from Fort Stockton on a day when there's nothing professional at stake and know you better. I want to write to you when you're on the Glass Mountain survey, if you'll receive letters." And I want to know, not yet, but in time, if there is a version of your life where a fixed point could be desirable rather than constraining." She was quiet for what felt like a long time, though it was probably 10 seconds. "I've been moving my whole life," she said. "Moving through country, moving between jobs, moving between the world I grew up in and the world I learned later. I've told myself that the movement is what I need." She paused. "But a fixed point doesn't have to mean a cage. It can mean an anchor, something that holds you to one location not because you're trapped but because the location is worth the holding." "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She looked at him in the lamplight and he looked back at her, and the night was large around them and the stars were doing what the Texas stars do, which is to be overwhelming, and she said, "Write your letters, Levi Maddox." He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen on that serious, handsome face, and it changed him considerably. "I'll make them worth reading," he said. She rode out for the Glass Mountains the following Monday, and he rode north to begin organizing the Abilene Drive, and they were separated by 50 miles and busy work and the essential demands of their respective lives, and he wrote letters. He wrote letters that were, he suspected, better than he had any right to expect from a man whose primary literary experience was account books and telegram brevity. He described the ranch in the evening light and the particular way the limestone hills looked after rain. He described the drive preparations and the small political dramas of a working cattle operation. He described once, with some diffidence, what it had been like to stand in that relay station with the telegram in his hand, and what it had been like, 4 days later, to hear his herd in that hidden canyon, and what it had been like to know that the specific mind and knowledge of one specific woman had made the difference between everything and nothing. She wrote back. Her letters were not long, but they were exact and full. She described terrain with the same authority she brought to everything, but within the descriptions were moments of pure observation that had nothing to do with professional utility. The specific color of the Glass Mountains at sunset, a pair of golden eagles she had watched for an afternoon from a canyon rim, the way her mare Vera had decided she approved of a particular young cowboy on the survey crew, and followed him around the camp with the devoted attention of a dog. She described a conversation she had had with one of the survey engineers, a young man from Philadelphia who had never been west of the Mississippi before, who had stood on a mesa top in the late afternoon and started crying without quite knowing why, and she had understood it perfectly. The way the country does that to people, breaks through the ordinary containment of themselves and reaches something undefended. She signed her letters simply Julia, and he read them more times than he would have admitted to anyone. The warning she had given him about Harlan Sisk proved to be well-founded and timely. 3 weeks after the cattle were recovered, and while the drive preparations were underway, one of the Fort Stockton hands brought Levi word that Cutter Walsh and Ben Farrow had been seen riding the eastern perimeter of the Maddox grazing lease with a third man, who was doing the kind of careful terrain reading that suggested documentation rather than casual travel. Levi sent a telegram to a lawyer in San Antonio named Prescott, who handled land matters, and had Prescott do a search of recent filings at the county land office. What came back was interesting. 3 properties adjacent to the Maddox Ranch had changed hands in the past 18 months, all sold under circumstances that involved financial pressure and below-market prices. 2 of those sellers had subsequently reported that documents they had signed were not quite what they had been represented as being, though by the time they understood this, the transactions were legally complete. Levi Maddox was not a man who waited for trouble to arrive at full speed. He spent 2 days organizing his documentation, confirming the integrity of his own land grant with Prescott's office, filing additional protective instruments that cost money he did not have in abundance, but that created a legal structure around the ranch property that would resist the kind of casual document manipulation Sisk had apparently employed elsewhere. Then he rode to find Harlan Sisk. Sisk had an office in the town of Marfa, about 40 miles southwest of Fort Stockton, and he was the kind of man whose operations had the surface appearance of legitimate commerce: a cattle brokerage, a land-holding company, an interest in a freighting concern, all of it plausible from a distance and somewhat less plausible on close examination. Levi walked into that office with the quiet, flat-eyed steadiness of a man who is not looking for a fight, but has made complete peace with the possibility of one. And he told Harlan Sisk, in specific and factual language, exactly what documentation he had filed and what legal protections were now in place, and what the consequences would be for any action that violated those protections. Sisk was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the well-maintained appearance of someone who spent money on his presentation, and the eyes of someone who had been doing careful arithmetic since before the conversation began. He listened to Levi without expression and then said, in a voice that was almost friendly, "I don't know what you've been told, Maddox, but I'm a legitimate businessman. I don't have any particular interest in your operation." "Good," Levi said. "Let's keep it that way." He rode back to the ranch with the particular satisfaction of a man who has removed a specific threat by the simple expedient of making it uneconomical, and he wrote Julia a letter that night that was unusually direct. He told her about Sisk and what he had done about it, and he told her why he was telling her, which was that she had warned him and deserved to know the warning had been used well. And then, at the end of that letter, he wrote a paragraph that he read 3 times before he sealed the envelope, because it was considerably more honest than he was entirely comfortable being on paper. He told her that the week since she had ridden south had shown him with considerable clarity that the fixed point he wanted was specifically connected to her continued existence in his general vicinity, and that he was aware this was asking a great deal of a woman whose entire life had been organized around the value of free movement, and that he was not asking her to choose or to decide anything, only to know that when she came back from the Glass Mountains survey, he would like to take her riding on the ranch and show her the limestone hill where he had stood and known this was the ground. Julia received that letter in a canvas tent in the Glass Mountains, and she read it twice and sat with it for a long while, watching the mountains change color in the afternoon light, and then she wrote back 3 days later. She told him that she had been thinking about what it meant to know a piece of country well enough to trust it, that the 3 years with the mescalero had taught her that real relationship to land was not ownership, it was belonging, and that belonging was mutual, a two-way knowing. She had spent her whole adult life learning to belong to the canyon country in that reciprocal way. She had not expected to find that same quality in relationship to a person. She wrote that she was not good at being known. She was practiced at knowing. The reversal of direction was unfamiliar, and she found it both frightening and, in the specific instance of his letters, less frightening than she had expected such a thing to be. She said she would be back in Fort Stockton in 10 days, and she wanted to see that limestone hill. Those 10 days were among the longest of Levi Maddox's life since the night his father died, which he considered a meaningful data point. When she rode into Fort Stockton, and he met her in front of Clyde's relay station on a clear July afternoon, the particular quality of their greeting was everything that had been building since that first campfire in the canyon and the lamplight outside the hotel. 2 people who have been talking honestly across 50 miles of paper and distance, finally standing in the same space again with all of that said and understood between them. He had brought 2 horses saddled and ready. She looked at Vera and looked at the second horse, a steady gray gelding, and then she looked at him. "The limestone hill," she said. "If you're ready," he said. "I've been ready since the Glass Mountains," she said. They rode out of town together in the afternoon light, and the country opened before them in the way it always did out here, enormously and without apology, and they rode side by side at a comfortable pace, and talked in the unhurried, continuous way of people who have discovered that the supply of things worth saying to each other appears to be inexhaustible. He showed her the hill. It was not dramatic by the standards of canyon country, A moderate limestone rise above a seasonal creek that had cottonwood trees along its banks and the particular clean smell of water and rock and old grass. But it had a quality of stillness and rightness that she understood immediately, the way she had understood, on her first visit to the high Guadalupe canyons, that she was in the presence of country that would matter to her for the rest of her life. She stood at the top of the hill and looked at the spread of the ranch below, the corrals and the low limestone buildings and the grazing land extending south toward the first lift of the canyon country, and she understood with a comprehension that was physical as well as intellectual why he had stood here and made his decision. "This is good ground," she said. "I know," he said. He was standing close beside her, not pressing, not presuming, just present. She turned and looked at him with the full directness of her attention, and he met it without flinching, and she said, "I have been thinking since the canyon about what you said, that you don't want this to be the end of knowing me." "I meant it," he said. "I know you meant it," she said. "What I've been thinking about is whether I have the courage to stop moving." She paused. "Not to stop entirely, I don't think I could, but to have a reason to come back, a specific gravity." He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way you take hold of something valuable, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him. "I want to be your specific gravity," he said. She laughed softly, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, and it was warm and real, and it changed her face completely, and he thought in that moment that he would spend a considerable portion of the rest of his life trying to make that happen again. "That is the most impractical thing you have ever said to me," she told him. "I'm a practical man," he said. "I think I'm allowed one impractical sentence." She looked at him for one more beat, and then she stepped into him and kissed him, which was the most direct thing she had ever done in his presence, which was saying something. And he kissed her back with both hands, and with everything he had been holding in reserve since that first campfire. And the limestone hill and the cottonwood creek and the enormous Texas sky were witness to all of it. They were married in November of 1878, in a simple ceremony at Fort Stockton's small church, with Clyde Perkins standing in as witness and Pete Garza and Darnell Hicks and Amos in their Sunday best in the pews, and Vera the paint mare visible through the church window tied to the post outside, because Julia had arranged it that way and no one had thought to argue. Julia wore a dress for the second time in Levi's experience of her, and it was the same green dress, and she wore her hair down for the occasion. And Levi Maddox stood at the front of that church and watched her walk toward him with the particular quality of attention he had been giving her since that first morning in the Badlands, and he felt the full, specific gratitude of a man who knows exactly what he has been given. She made her own vows. She had written them herself, quietly and without consultation, and she delivered them in her characteristic direct way, which meant she said exactly what she meant without flourish, and it landed with the weight of complete honesty. She said that she had spent her whole life learning to read the landscape in front of her, and that she had never expected to find that the most remarkable piece of country she had encountered was another person, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life continuing to map him, and that she expected the terrain to be complex and interesting and occasionally formidable and entirely worth it. Levi did not have written vows. He said, simply and clearly, that he had stood on a limestone hill at 29 years old and known that he had found the ground he wanted to build on, and that he had not known then that the ground would eventually include her, and that it was the best and most important discovery of his life. There was not a dry eye in the Fort Stockton church, including Darnell Hicks, who was facing away from everyone and appeared to be deeply interested in the construction of the window frame. They spent their first winter on the ranch together, and it was a winter of genuine discovery, the discovery that the best thing about choosing to build a life with the right person is that the days acquire a quality they did not have before, a quality of shared attention that makes ordinary things more present and extraordinary things almost unbearable in their richness. Julia continued guiding. She had made it clear before the wedding that this was not negotiable, and Levi had never asked for it to be. understanding from the first that the specific quality of who she was could not be separated from the work that had formed her. She took 2 or 3 longer guide jobs each year, spending stretches of weeks away in the canyon country or the mountain surveys, and she came back each time with new information about the country that found its way into the ranch's understanding of the land around it. New knowledge about water sources and grazing patterns and seasonal terrain changes that made Maddox land more productive year by year. In her absences, Levi wrote letters, and she wrote back from campsites and survey tents in the same exact, observation-full language that had made him fall in love with her mind long before he had fully understood he was falling in love at all. The Abilene Drive in the late spring of 1879 went without significant incident, and the cattle sold at a price that cleared the bank debt and left the ranch in a financial position it had never previously enjoyed. Levi stood at the stockyard in Abilene watching the last of the cattle move into the pens, and he thought about the telegram that had fallen from his fingers in Fort Stockton less than a year before, and he thought about a hidden canyon and a woman who knew it, and the arithmetic of what had actually happened struck him with the particular force of things that are too large to look at directly when they are occurring. He sent Julia a telegram that said only, "Debt clear. Drive done. Coming home. We are all right." She sent one back that said, "I know we are, come home." In the spring of 1880, Julia told him over breakfast with the directness she brought to everything including this that she was going to have a baby. He put down his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something breakable. "How long have you known?" he asked. 2 weeks, she said. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything. I'm certain." He looked at her across the table with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, completely unguarded and completely full, the expression of a man for whom language has become insufficient. He got up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in both of his large, capable hands and looked at her in that careful, attending way he had, and he said, "You and I are going to be remarkable parents." "Bold claim," she said, but she was smiling. "Based on evidence," he said, and kissed her forehead. Their son was born in October of 1880, delivered by a capable midwife from Fort Stockton, and they named him Thomas Jacob Maddox, for Julia's father and Levi's father, which felt both right and sufficient. Thomas was born loud and energetic, and with a quality of attention in his dark eyes that his mother recognized. Julia was back in the saddle within 6 weeks, which the midwife declared entirely inadvisable, and which Darnell Hicks took as confirmation of something he had known from the beginning. Levi, watching her ride out on Vera one clear December morning with Thomas, in a carrier on her back that she had constructed from Apache-style design principles, felt what could only be described as a love so large it pressed against the inside of his chest with persistent insistence. Darnell rode up beside him as he stood watching. "Told you," Darnell said. "Told me what?" Levi said. "Told you a woman who could find 400 lost cattle in the Badlands was not someone you wanted to let ride out of Fort Stockton without an agreement." "You told me no such thing," Levi said. "I thought it very loudly in your direction," Darnell said. "You should have heard it." Levi smiled. Harlan Sisk made one more attempt at the ranch in the winter of 1880, using a document challenge through the county court, and it failed with the completeness of poorly planned things encountering well-documented resistance. Prescott, the San Antonio lawyer, handled it with the brisk efficiency of a man who had anticipated exactly this move, and the case was dismissed before spring, and Sisk thereafter confined himself to operations that did not involve the Maddox Ranch, apparently having concluded that the expected ease had never materialized and was not going to. The Mescalero Apache were enduring a period of profound injustice during these years, forced movements and treaty violations, and the progressive restriction of the land they had inhabited for centuries. And Julia felt this with the specific anguish of someone who had been welcomed into that world and loved people within it. She could not undo the machinery of federal policy, but she did what she could, which included guiding Army survey teams with an absolute insistence that known sacred sites be accurately documented and flagged rather than recorded as empty territory, a small but not meaningless resistance against the complete erasure of a living geography. She brought Thomas to the Guadalupe Mountains when he was old enough to ride, and she showed him the country the way she had been shown it, as language rather than landscape, as a living, reciprocal relationship rather than a resource to be extracted from. Their second child arrived in 1883, a girl they named Lucinda, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's particular quality of alert, cataloging attention. Lucinda was talking at 11 months and climbing everything available to her shortly thereafter, which Levi took as evidence of genetic determination, and Julia took as an opportunity to begin a very early education in risk assessment. In the summer of 1884, with Thomas 4 years old and Lucinda approaching 1, Julia Bristol Maddox rode alone into the canyon country south of the Pecos for the first time since the recovery of the herd, on a 2-day solo survey that she had told Levi about in advance, and that he had received with the equanimity of a man who had long since made his peace with being married to someone whose self-sufficiency was a permanent feature of who she was. She rode into the East Pocket Canyon on the first afternoon and sat on Vera in the entrance where 6 years before she had heard 400 cattle, and turned to see the full weight of relief and gratitude and something much larger moving across Levi Maddox's face. The canyon was empty of cattle now. Grass growing undisturbed, spring running clear, the limestone walls holding the same ancient silence. She sat there for a while, thinking about the particular arithmetic of 6 years and all the ways a life can turn on a single conversation in a relay station, a single decision by a man who needed help and hired the right person for reasons that had started practical and become everything else. She took out her survey notebook and made notes about the seasonal water level and the grass growth patterns and the condition of the canyon walls, because she was a professional and she was never not working when she was in the country. And then she closed the notebook and allowed herself to simply be present in the place where the story had turned. She thought about Levi. She thought about Thomas with his dark eyes and his loud opinions. She thought about Lucinda, who already had the look of someone organizing the world according to her own assessment. She thought about the morning she had ridden south into this canyon and said, in a voice that was certainty rather than hope, "I know where your cattle are." She had known. She had always known. What she had not known, what she had not been able to survey or map or predict, was that the man following her into that canyon carried within him the specific quality of attention and respect and genuine recognition that she had been, without quite admitting it, waiting for her entire adult life. The country had given her back to herself in those 3 years with the mescalero. It had given her knowledge and capability, and a self-possession so complete it had sometimes felt like a wall rather than a foundation. Levi Maddox had shown her the difference. She rode back to the ranch in the long, golden light of the Texas summer evening, and she could see the limestone buildings from a distance and the smoke from the kitchen fire, and she could see, when she got closer, a tall figure standing by the corral gate, because he always came to meet her when she returned, without fail, without exception, because that was the particular quality of the man. That he met things directly and held them carefully, and did not pretend that the ordinary could be safely taken for granted. She rode through the gate and he took Vera's reins and she swung down and he was right there, and she put her hand flat against his chest where his heart was and looked up at him with the full, direct, unguarded attention that she gave to nothing else on earth. "Good survey?" he asked. "Very good," she said. "The East Pocket Spring is running strong. The canyon is healthy." He covered her hand with his. "And you," he said, "are you healthy?" "Very," she said. He pulled her into him with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been doing this for 6 years, and has never once found it anything other than exactly right. And she went without any of the resistance that had once been her first instinct in all matters of being held, because she had learned with him the difference between being held and being constrained, and it was a distinction she had not expected to learn so completely. Thomas appeared in the doorway of the house and called out that supper was ready and that Lucinda had thrown her spoon at the wall, and would somebody please come and deal with the situation. Julia laughed against Levi's chest, that full warm laugh, and he felt it and was pleased. "I believe we are being summoned," he said. "We are always being summoned," she said, and she was smiling as she said it in the way of a woman who finds the summons more than acceptable. They walked toward the house together, and the evening light was copper on the limestone walls, and the first stars were arriving in the east, and the canyon country to the south was settling into its vast and patient dark, keeping its secrets the way it always had, giving back what it chose to give back to those who knew it well enough to ask in the right language. The Maddox Ranch ran strong for many years. The herd rebuilt to 600 head within 3 seasons and to 800 by 1886, and the land paid back what had been poured into it with the patient, compound generosity of good ground well managed. Darnell Hicks stayed on as trail boss until his retirement in 1891, and Pete Garza became one of the most knowledgeable range managers in the Pecos country, and Amos remained what he had always been, which was the kind of steady, wordless competence that holds operations together without ever requiring recognition. Julia guided until 1889, when she transitioned her knowledge into a different form, working with the Texas General Land Office on a comprehensive mapping project for the Pecos Canyon system that drew on everything she knew about the country, the official surveys and the Army Corps work, and the deep, living knowledge she had carried since the 3 years in the Guadalupe Mountains. The resulting maps were the most accurate documentation of that terrain produced in the 19th century, and they bore her name, Julia Bristol Maddox, surveyor and guide, in the formal print of official government documents. She found this considerably more satisfying than she had expected. Thomas Maddox grew up knowing how to read canyon terrain before he knew how to read print, and he developed his mother's specific gift for it, that quality of reading landscape as a living document rather than a static obstacle, and he grew into a young man who could navigate the Badlands country south of the Pecos as well as his mother, and who had inherited his father's steadiness, and his mother's precision in a combination that was entirely his own. Lucinda grew up with her father's gray eyes and her mother's absolutely unconditional relationship with horses and her own particular genius for arithmetic and accounts, which manifested early and insistently in the ranch bookkeeping, which Levi surrendered to her management with enormous relief when she was 14 and extraordinary relief when he saw what she did with it. They had a third child in 1886, another boy, named Elias, who arrived with his mother's dark hair and his father's size, and a quality of absolute determination that made itself known approximately 30 seconds after his first breath and never relented. In the autumn of 1887, Levi and Julia rode out together on a Sunday afternoon with no particular destination, which was a luxury they permitted themselves occasionally, and they rode south into the limestone hills and found themselves, without quite planning it, at the hill above the seasonal creek with the cottonwood trees, the hill where he had stood at 29 and known this was the ground, the hill where she had stood at 37 and known she was home. They rode to the top and sat their horses side by side in the way they had sat horses together for nearly a decade, with the easy parallel fluency of two people who have moved through the same country for long enough that they breathe in the same rhythm. The ranch spread below them in the autumn light, the corrals and the buildings and the grazing land and the far southern horizon where the canyon country began, where the hidden pockets and blind draws kept their secrets and gave back what they chose to give back to those who knew the language. "Levi," Julia said. "Yes, I need to tell you something," He looked at her. "I was wrong in 1878, she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I told you in Fort Stockton that I was always my own, that working for one person meant I was no longer my own." She was looking at the country below, and her voice had the particular quality of someone completing a calculation they have been working on for years. "I was wrong about the terms of the equation. Being with you hasn't made me less my own. It's made me more." She paused. "I needed you to know I understood that." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that," he said. "I know you know it," she said. "I wanted to say it anyway." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, in the same careful, deliberate way he had taken it the first time on this hill, and she laced her fingers through his with the same ease and completeness that had grown over 9 years from something new and uncertain into something as natural as breathing. The afternoon light moved across the limestone country in long, slow waves, and the cottonwood trees below were turning gold with the season. And somewhere to the south in the canyon country, the hidden springs ran clear, and the grass grew in the secret pockets, and the country held its age and its knowledge with the patient indifference of things that outlast everything human except what is genuinely and deeply made. Julia Bristol Maddox looked at the country she had mapped, and the ranch she had come home to, and the man whose hand she held, and she thought that she had spent her life learning to read landscapes, learning the language of stone and water and living terrain, and that the country did not speak louder or with more clarity than what she had found in this specific place, this specific life, this specific person. She had found every last head of cattle in the Badlands south of the Pecos, because she knew the land's language well enough to ask the right questions in the right places. She had found something considerably rarer. She understood now, in the ranch above the limestone hills, in the morning letters and the evening fires and the children who combined their parents' qualities into something entirely their own, in the man who had met her at the corral gate every time she came home, because he was not the kind of man who could pretend that return was ordinary. She had found it, and she had known it for what it was, and she had not let it go. Levi turned his head and looked at her, and his face had the expression it always had when he looked at her, the specific, attending, fully present expression of a man who has never once stopped finding her interesting, and he said, "Come on, let's go home." She smiled. "Yes," Julia Bristol Maddox said, and turned her horse toward the ranch, toward the smoke from the kitchen fire and the sound of children and the warm, particular gravity of everything she had chosen. "Let's go home."